Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Socially Radical Guitarist. The song you heard just now was from Travisor called EMD from the album Telemetry. It's a very nice mix of indie from a really proficient, skilled, and polished guitarist and a very polished band. So stay tuned, listen to that track and understand your culture. It's your culture that's being suppressed. So we have our guest. Well known among left circles in Canada. He started out as basically a lawyer for the enemy, a corporate lawyer, and then moved on to being a lawyer for the people, being a class action lawyer. He went through that political evolution and a very well-known, well-studied historian of the political struggle in Greece. So, welcome, Dimitri Lascaris. How's everything?
Great, Christian. Pleasure to be here. I look forward to a radical conversation.
All right, great. So, let's begin with your political, basically your career evolution. How did you end up going from corporate to class action? What was there anything political going on in your mind at that point, or was it just you having gone through that route because that's how you were trained in school?
Yeah, I think we have to go back further in time. I was raised, politically speaking, in what I would call a schizophrenic environment, because my parents emigrated from Greece in the aftermath of the Second World War. They lived through, as very young children, one of the most brutal Nazi occupations in Europe. And then at the moment where the Nazis were expelled from Greece, the ascendant power in Greece was the communist movement. They were the ones who had most effectively resisted the Nazi occupation in the southern part of the country where my parents were from. And the British and the Americans were quite concerned that the communists would take power. And so they assembled together a motley collection of monarchists and Nazi collaborators and neoliberals to effectively launch an armed struggle against the communists. And there then followed a brutal civil war in Greece. And by the time the communists were defeated with the help of the ruthless British, the country lay in smoking ruins. And out of that disaster, my parents were afforded the opportunity by the government of Canada to come to Greece. They were in their teens and they had no high school education at all, not even a year of high school education. And they were raised on a poor farm in the South, had many horrible memories of the Second World War and the Civil War that followed. And they took the opportunity to come to Canada, not because they felt a burning desire to leave Greece, they didn't, but because there was absolutely no economic opportunity for them. So I came out of that environment, but at the same time, my parents were quite nationalistic and right-wing. They were raised in a fairly religious family. Their family was much more aligned with the monarchist side than it was with the communists. In fact, when I was a kid growing up, communism was a dirty word. Even if you supported the Social Democratic Party in Greece, which was called PASOK, you were considered a pariah in my family. So it was a very right-wing upbringing, even though we came from very humble origins. And that's why I say it was kind of schizophrenic. So when I went off to law school, and then was afforded the opportunity to work on Wall Street, I really had a conflicted political identity. On the one hand, I had been raised in this right-wing environment, but at the same time, I was very conscious of the fact that my family came from oppression and poverty and a complete lack of privilege. And I didn't at all identify with what I discovered on Wall Street. And what I discovered on Wall Street was just a milieu of extraordinary privilege. Everybody I dealt with, virtually all of them had gone to a private school. They then attended an Ivy League school because their parents were someone special. A lot of them had a Roman numeral after their name. This was all very foreign and alien to me. And I saw firsthand very quickly how their privileges had given them extraordinary advantages in life, which I had never even dreamt of enjoying. And so I really felt alien in that environment. And especially, and as time went by, seeing what I saw, how they brought to bear their privilege in order to suppress the types of legislative reforms and regulatory actions that were necessary for the protection of ordinary Americans, I decided very quickly that that wasn't for me. And I left the practice of law. I was so disenchanted by it that I went off and I did something quite unusual for a few years. I was a blackjack card counter. Some disgruntled Wall Street lawyers, because I wasn't the only one on Wall Street, there were quite a few of us, we somehow gravitated to each other, and a couple of them, brother and sister who had gone to Yale and Stanford, worked at two Wall Street firms, and got to know me in the course of my work. They decided to create a blackjack card counting team. And we viewed ourselves as, basically sort of taking from the rich and giving to ourselves, the rich being the casino industry. So I did that for a few years, and I realized after doing that for some time, and I didn't make a lot of money. I made enough money to, basically support myself, my wife, my kids, and comfortably, but I was certainly making less money than I had made as a lawyer in Wall Street. I realized that what I was doing had no social utility at all. On the one hand, yes, it's true, we were fighting large, massive, multi-billion-dollar corporations who were ruthless in exploiting the public, but we weren't giving anything. It was a wealth transfer from those casino corporations to us. And so I became, I wanted to use my skills as a lawyer to actually begin to do something that had social utility and something that was of advantage to people who were disadvantaged. And that's when I was presented an opportunity to become a class actions lawyer. And I finally found a place in the law that I felt very comfortable with from sort of an ethical and moral perspective. And did that for 12 years, I think. And then I was very fortunate in that. It was very successful endeavor. And I got to the age of 54 and realized I didn't really need to work to make money anymore. So I said, it's time for me to become an activist and an independent journalist and devote myself to politics if I can. So I gave up the practice of law, at least class actions law. I started to do a lot of pro bono work. And that's where I am today. I spend a lot of time doing pro bono work. I do a little bit of paid work if it's of interest to me, of a class actions nature. I do a lot of activism and a fair bit of independent journalism as well. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but that's kind of, there are a lot of other things that happened along the way in my political journey, but those are the broad strokes.
It's a great answer. And we love long-winded answers because it's a great way for our listeners to understand who you are. If you looked at previous interviews, nobody's ever had a problem with how I've interviewed them or being long-winded. We let you be you.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So I guess this then goes into your participation in the Green Party. And I want to ask a little bit about the contentious leadership race, particularly your platform on eco-socialism and what ended up happening there. So what was the message you were trying to bring out within the Green Party when you ran for the leadership position? Do you think that there are things you could have done better to win that position? Or do you think there were just structural disagreements or ideological disagreements that couldn't be reconciled? And do you in a way feel vindicated by the spectacular crash that happened with Anamie Paul's campaign? That's a pretty loaded question, but just wonder.
Yeah, there's a few questions in there, so
yeah,
try to deal with them in the order in which you asked them. In terms of whether we could have done anything better, absolutely. We didn't have a professional campaign team. It started with me going to I struggled for 3 or 4 months with the whole question of whether I should run. I actually, at that time, virtually nobody in the Green Party knew anything about Anamie Paul. And she had almost no public record at all at that time. It was very unusual for somebody entering a leadership race. And so I actually reached out to her before entering the race because I thought, I was intrigued, and I thought maybe the right thing for me to do is to support this candidate from a racialized community who was speaking a language that was, fairly progressive, but I couldn't get a sense from her public record because it was so limited whether she in fact was radical, whether she would view herself as being eco-socialist. So I asked her if she would meet with me in Toronto, and I told her very clearly, I'll come to where you live, at a time and place of your convenience. And I just want to talk to you about sort of core issues and figure out, whether I should support you rather than enter the race myself. And to my surprise and disappointment, she refused to meet with me. I later came to believe, I can't say this with certainty because she didn't explain why, but I think it had to do with my position with respect to Israel and Palestine. And the fact that I've been very critical of some politicians in this country who are enthusiastic supporters of Israel. So I think that's why she didn't feel comfortable meeting with me. But at the end of the day, it was what it was. I had to make a decision whether or not to run based upon very little knowledge of who she was. So I decided to enter the race because I just couldn't see anybody. I didn't have the confidence that anybody else who had entered the race was going to present a radical agenda. I didn't want it. I didn't really, want to assume the position of leadership in a political party. I had deep skepticism about electoral politics. But it seemed to me that the country was in desperate need of a radical voice at the federal level, and certainly not being provided by the NDP either. So I entered the race, and then I started casting about for a campaign team, and I went to people who were close friends of mine, politically aligned with me, comfortable with eco-socialism, but none of whom was really a professional campaigner. Some of whom had no prior history with the Green Party at all. Some of them were political independents on the left. Others had a long but dissatisfying association with the NDP. And some of them were longtime Greens. And we came together, and at the beginning, it was just a mess. Our campaign was a complete mess. We had no real plan. But as time went by, we began to, I think, operate like a well-oiled machine. We began to see that our message of eco-socialism was resonating with people. It gave us a great deal of motivation to come together, build the team, strengthen our message. And by the time we got to third or fourth month of the leadership contest, the fundraising showed that we were in second place. And even though I think it's fair to say that the former leader, Elizabeth May, was I think, and she subsequently, I think, acknowledged this in the Toronto Star op-ed, she was quite visibly supportive of Anamie Paul at that stage and was quite viscerally opposed to my leadership bid. So despite those facts, we were very close to being number one in fundraising. And ultimately, we finished second place on the 8th and final ballot. On the 5th ballot, I was actually in the lead. So I didn't feel at all bitter about the outcome. I felt very inspired by it, frankly, that so many people supported the campaign despite the obstacles we confronted. In terms of whether I feel vindicated, I think what happened to Anamie is, really sad. It's hard to feel vindicated, really. I mean, I feel vindicated in the sense that the leadership contest, I don't believe fundamentally it was fair. The former leader declared on national television before I entered the race that she was going to be scrupulously neutral. Those were her words. She wasn't. She's admitted as much now. That certainly wasn't something that I was happy about. But I never would have wished upon Anamie or anybody who became the leader what happened. It was a terrible year that we've gone through. And I think we as a party have a lot of work to do to recover our credibility with Canadians.
Yeah, and a lot of Canadians that's stand by, watch, and looking for a radical alternative to basically the status quo in terms of domestic and foreign policy we look at basically what happened with the Green Party, and we end up, sighing. There was a particularly contentious vote, one that bi-party, the Communist Party, was viscerally opposed to, and that was the declaration that China was committing a genocide. The Green Party ended up voting along with the Conservatives and the NDP, declaring genocide, saying that the Winter Olympics should be boycotted. I know that a lot of people don't realize that the responsibility to protect doctrine was something pushed by NATO in the UN, and what that ends up meaning from a warmongering standpoint when you declare that a country is committing a genocide. What is your take on that? How do you feel about the party's position on foreign policy in that respect, and then their position on Israel and its occupation?
Well, with respect to China, I disagree with the party's stance. I think that our MPs were wrong to jump so quickly on the genocide bandwagon. Let me say, first of all, that I think the evidence is quite clear that the Chinese government has been dealing for a number of years with a very serious, real problem of terrorism in Xinjiang. I do believe that the government has reacted in a rather draconian way to the terrorist threat, and that it has suppressed civil liberties to an unacceptable degree. I do think that there are human rights abuses taking place in Xinjiang, which I believe are largely driven by this overreaction to what is a real significant terrorist threat. But I don't believe that it's really any different, and quite arguably not as severe as the reaction of Western states to the terrorist threat that emerged in 9/11. For example, as we all know, in response to the 9/11 attacks, and based entirely on fraudulent intelligence, the United States essentially laid waste to an entire country, Iraq, which had absolutely nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. The United States government engaged in torture at Guantanamo and other black sites around the world. And then, when Barack Obama came to power, he basically washed his hands of it and said, I'm not going to hold any of these tortures accountable, even though he himself, in his first bid for the Democratic nomination, openly acknowledged that the United States had engaged in torture. And we could go on and on, the war in Afghanistan, the destruction of Libya, over and over again. The Western governments over the past 20 years have used the threat of terrorism and a purported concern for human rights in order to engage in the most heinous acts of brutality. And I really don't I don't condone at all. And in fact, I condemn any abridgment of the human rights of the Uyghur people by the Chinese government. And I believe there have been abuses. But I don't think we're really in a position of any moral authority to lecture the Chinese about that in light of our own abominable human rights record, and particularly the way we dealt with the threat of terrorism in the post 9/11 period. Now, furthermore, it's a little known fact that the State Department, in the month leading up to the Trump administration's declaration that China was committing genocide, and this was something that happened, I believe, on the last day of the Trump presidency. The timing of it stunk to high heaven. The State Department attorneys advised Donald Trump that they believed that there was insufficient evidence to accuse China of genocide. This is the State Department's own attorneys. This is something that the Canadian government and our parliament completely ignored. And what was the basis upon which they accused China of genocide? Well, they brought, they conducted these hearings before a human rights committee of parliament, at which every single individual who was brought forward was somebody who had embraced essentially the genocide narrative. There was nobody who came forward to present an alternative point of view. I actually checked with the clerk of that committee. No representative of the Chinese government was invited to respond to the extremely serious allegations being made against it by these witnesses. The star witness was this clown by the name of Adrian Zentz, a far-right end of worlder who has really no significant expertise in Xinjiang whatsoever, and has a clear political agenda, and whose methodologies have been, I think, exposed in some respects as being outright fraudulent in terms of, the evidence he's put forward, or so-called evidence he's put forward in support of the genocide allegation. So I'm deeply troubled, although I accept and I condemn unequivocally that there are human rights abuses taking place in Xinjiang. The Uyghur people have seen their civil liberties breached in a quite serious way. I don't believe that the evidence establishes that China has committed genocide. I think that this is highly politically motivated and is extremely dangerous because we desperately need to deal cooperatively with the Chinese on a range of pressing security issues, most importantly, the climate crisis. We need to deal with them on the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. When we look at military spending and the distribution of military forces in the world, it is ridiculous for us to characterize the state of China as the aggressor in its relations with the West. The United States government spends, I believe, almost 4 times as much as its military on China. It has over 800 military bases in foreign countries. The Chinese state has 1 foreign military base. It has, I think, a few hundred nuclear weapons. The United States has thousands of nuclear weapons. It is the Western military forces who are sending military vessels into the South China Sea, into the Strait of Taiwan. It's not the Chinese who are sending, belligerent forces off of our coastlines, threatening us. So I think that our policies towards China are morally bankrupt. I think they're extremely dangerous. And at the end of the day, we simply do not have the moral authority to lecture the Chinese or anybody else about human rights because of the fact that we've aligned ourselves with the United States government. We've aligned ourselves with the state of Israel, which is committing the crime of apartheid. We've aligned ourselves with Saudi Arabia, which is committing a genocide in Yemen before the eyes of the world, murdered a Washington Post journalist in cold blood, brutally suppresses women, brutally suppresses the Shia minority in the south of the country. Who are we to lecture the Chinese about human rights? We have absolutely no credibility, none whatsoever, to lecture anybody about human rights. And so I think we really need to start, if we're going to have discussions with other countries, especially powerful countries with whom we need to be cooperating to deal with existential crises confronting us, we first need to establish our own moral authority. And we are far from having done that. We've undermined it completely.
That's a very powerful statement. It's good to see that within the Green Party, there are people with acting on principle when it comes to foreign policy. Although we don't necessarily agree on everything, it's good that there's that dynamics within, the left current. I'd like to ask what your take is on, the recent discovery that kind of led to the cancellation of the holiday on July 1st, the discovery of the mass graves, the staunch reality that really reconciliation hasn't really been addressed, and that the legacy of colonialism isn't just supported, it's also been enacted directly by this government, by the Canadian government. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think the genocide is ongoing in this country. It never actually ended. The worst, most horrific aspects of it have stopped. The residential school system was mercifully ended. One of the greatest, atrocities imaginable, the residential schools children, what was done to those children. My God, I mean, this is a scar in the conscience of our nation, which we've not even begun to deal with in a meaningful way. But at least it's not, the system doesn't continue to exist. There was some level of compensation paid to the victims, although it was grossly inadequate in my opinion. But the legacy of genocide continues when, we see, for example, that indigenous communities around the country don't have access to clean water. We would never tolerate this in predominantly white communities, but we do with indigenous peoples. When we see what's being done, on, for example, Wet'suwet'en lands, where despite an existential climate emergency, we're basically sending in militarized police to brutally suppress legitimate resistance by indigenous peoples to extractive activities on their lands. When you look at the level of the gross overrepresentation of indigenous persons and also Black persons in our correctional system, our so-called correctional system, you look at the poverty, the lack of adequate health care in indigenous communities. The crime of genocide is an ongoing crime in this country. Its worst features have only been attenuated somewhat, but it's by no means been ended. And this too it's quite apart from the fact that it is just fundamentally wrong. That too is depriving us of the moral authority to play a leadership role in the defense of human rights domestically and internationally. We have absolutely no credibility. The Chinese government often talks about our violations of indigenous rights. Shouldn't surprise anybody that they do so. Nobody listens, of course. The mainstream media never repeats those critiques. But they're entirely correct to point out that we have absolutely no credibility when it comes to human rights, just based upon our own treatment of indigenous peoples. So I personally believe that, first of all, for us to even begin to deal with the problem of the suppression of indigenous rights in a meaningful way, we have to give indigenous peoples a veto over extractive activities on their lands, an outright veto. Right now, what we have in this country is a duty to consult, which is routinely flouted by federal and provincial governments and by extractive corporations. And what that means is that at the end of the day, if they consult and they say, well, we heard you, we're just going to proceed anyways with the extractive activities on your lands, they're permitted to do that. Under UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they have a right of veto, and consultation is not adequate. Even real consultation is not adequate. If they say no, we have to respect their decision. It has to be the decision of those who represent them according to their own laws and customs, not the people we say represent them under our laws and customs. And the other thing I think we should do, and this is something I campaigned on in the leadership contest, is we should allocate a fixed percentage of Canadian GDP every year to Indigenous communities, so that they have a substantial and predictable source of funding coming from the economic activities which are happening to a significant extent on their lands. And only then, look, you can't deal with social injustice without massive wealth redistribution, whether you're talking about Indigenous persons, whether you're talking about racialized persons in other communities, whether you're talking about the working poor in the white community. We need to effect a massive redistribution of wealth in order to have a socially just society. That's the reality. And this is something that I really believe the Green Party has to say much more loudly, clearly, and courageously than it has in the past. We have to take from the rich and give to the poor. End of story. And I'm talking about a massive redistribution of wealth, not a minor one like that pathetic 1% wealth tax that the NDP has been advocating for, which at the end is a Band-Aid, will accomplish nothing.
Excellent. I mean, you're sounding pretty radical to me. I think that's the reason why you didn't win, to be quite honest.
But I'll tell you, Christian, I actually, I know it is radical by the standards of Canadian politics, but to me, this is just like basic human decency, right? Yeah. Like what's radical, extreme, is that we have 10 people controlling 80, $90 billion of wealth, while we have tens of thousands of people living in the streets in this country. That's extremism. I'm just talking about basic human decency.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of segues into our final question. Do you think Canadian politics will be better served with a more powerful communist party? Yes or no?
Yes, 100%. The Communist Party, I spent a lot of time in Europe over the course of my professional life, and partly because I am Greek and have family in Greece. Communists are routinely elected to political office in European countries. In Greece, they routinely get 5% of the vote. At one point, I think they were relatively recently the third largest party in the Greek parliament. There are communists who've been elected in Portugal. In India, communists are in power in the state of Kerala, and they're doing a wonderful job, by the way, of redistributing wealth in that country and supporting the poor and ensuring everybody has their basic needs met. I think Canada and the United States would benefit greatly from having, a robust Communist Party, which actually has representation in provincial and federal legislatures, and are presenting a different perspective on how to deal with the fundamental injustices in our society than Canadians are being given. Our political discourse would be greatly enriched by that.
That is an excellent answer. And with that, we're going to conclude the show with the song that Dimitri Lascaris picked. Dimitri, what's the song we're ending the show with?
It's Arise Sun. It comes from a recent movie actually called The Card Counter. I recommend you watch the movie, not so much because it's about a card counter, but it's actually about the person happens to be a card counter, but it's a person who emerged from the Canadian or the United States intelligence community and had a very dark past. And the story is really about that person coming to terms with the horrible things he did in the name of the security of the United States. And this song, Arise Sun, is really, I think it does a wonderful job of conveying, the emotional trauma that movie exposed and so powerfully. Excellent.
And yeah, with that, we're going to be concluding. We're going to do the outro, and then we're going to have Dimitri Lascaris' song. That'll be the end of the show. We'll see you next week.